Alright, so, hello, my name's Brendan, but online I go by Bro3256, or simply Bro, and I'm here to present FamiWiki and the journey I've been on for the past year or so to properly documenting Famicom on the English internet while also running a wiki site from scratch. But before we can talk about FamiWiki and what led up to me founding this site, I want to give some background information that is going to be needed to build up why I founded this. So it all begins in like the late 2000s. I started getting into retro gaming, watching gameplay videos of the original Super Mario Brothers, and eventually my dad handing down his old Nintendo with a copy of Super Mario Brothers and Duck Hunt. And not long after, I started getting more and more interested into retro gaming in general. And this is a good time for me to interject with something that I've personally believed since day one into getting retro gaming. Nostalgia is not the only reason people get into retro gaming. Now sure, it is a factor that plays in when you get into retro gaming. In fact, I've even indulged in nostalgia stuff. And this should really tell you the era I grew up in. But when it comes to retro games, there is a value that there is to be had with the experience of engaging with how these old games play in a time when things weren't quite set in stone, or getting to play something that is unlike anything else you can find. Which leads me into eventually getting interested into import gaming. Specifically from Japan. Now, this didn't happen overnight. I had been buying Japanese video games from local video game stores and online stores like eBay and the sort. And in regards to starting in the late 2010s, I moved towards buying from proxy services and other online storefronts. In fact, some of the ones I have experience with using include Sendico, Zen Market, and J4U. Not sponsored. These are just the services I have been using to import Japanese stuff, and they've been pretty good for the most part. So if you're interested in importing stuff, I'd recommend checking them out. But so that's the point. And in regards to buying Japanese imports in general, there are some key points that you need to keep in mind. There's some pros and cons in getting into import gaming. First of all, it can be cheaper for the most part. This doesn't account for shipping costs or certain cases where the Japanese copy is more expensive than the American copy. But in most cases, you'll be spending less on Japanese games compared to local games. So give an extreme example, stadium events, like the original stadium events on the NES, that goes for roughly around over $10,000, but an original Famicom copy goes for less than $5,000. But you could argue that the later world-class track beyond NES is also $5,000, but that's beside the point. Let's see. Lose myself in the script, I apologize. Outside of price, another benefit in getting into Japanese video games is getting to play games that never released outside of Japan. So if you want an original copy of Holy Diver, for example, you seek out an original Famicom copy. And I am aware that Holy Diver did somewhat recently get unofficial re-release on NES through the original publisher, I think. But in terms of the original release, you seek it out through Japan. There's a whole world of video games to explore beyond what you can find locally. You start to build an appreciation of the games you import from Japan, whether that's due to the themes of the game or the reception it's had. But all that comes with the biggest caveat into getting into retro Japanese imports. The big one, the biggest con, is the language barrier. I mean, I imagine nobody here speaks Japanese. Watashi wa Nihongo hanasu. And I would imagine most, if not everyone in the audience, didn't understand what I just said. And if you did, I apologize for butchering the language. So, despite my interest in Japanese imports, I don't know Japanese, which I am trying to learn as I go. I have picked up a few things, but that's beside the point. So it makes playing stuff like RPGs more or less unplayable as an English speaker. So let's see. So the next con, most Japanese games are practically unknown outside of Japan. Some games that are beloved or well-liked in the country are practically non-existent outside, like internationally. The most obvious reason, it was never released outside of Japan, but cultural context for some games are outright missing when looking at them in the perspective of the West. And because of that, it leads to poor and really misinformed documentation on Japanese video games. And if you want to like fully understand Japanese games, whether it's for research purposes or wanting to enjoy games even more, you'd have to look at the perspective of Japanese video game players at the time, but you'll often find that we apply our own perspective. What do I mean by this? Well, that leads into one of the biggest misconceptions I ran into while trying to research the Famicom in particular. And that's how it is often considered that the Famicom is just a Japanese variant of the Nintendo Entertainment System, and nothing more than that. And I want to pause here and play this video my friend made. It's roughly around 3 minutes long and quickly goes over what I'm gonna discuss further along the lines. So let me go and put this video set up here.
This is the
all right. Here we go. So if
This is the family computer, aka the Famicom, and this is the Nintendo Entertainment System, aka the NES. The Famicom is not the NES. They are visibly different. The Famicom first released in Japan in 1983. The NES first released as a test launch in 1985, 2 years after it is the version released in most places that aren't Japan. So is the Famicom just a Japanese version of the NES in a different shape? Sort of, but not quite. They can both play Super Mario Bros., but Famicom Super Mario Bros. Looks like this. NES Super Mario Bros. Looks like this. You can play Famicom Super Mario Bros. On the Famicom, but not the NES. You can play NES Super Mario Bros. On the NES, but not the Famicom. Now you could do it with a third-party adapter and vice versa, but aside from that, NES and Famicom cards are not interchangeable. There are games that release for the Famicom, but not the NES. There are games that release for the NES, but not the Famicom. NES cards, with a few exceptions, almost always look the same, but Famicom cards can come in weird shapes and sizes. The Famicom has 2 hardwired controllers that you cannot unplug. The second controller lacks start and select buttons and has a funny microphone that you can make Let's Plays with. This is not present on the NES controller. The NES has controller ports that you can plug controllers into, as well as accessories like the NES Zapper. Plug it into controller port 2 and you can play Duck Hunt. You cannot plug the NES Zapper into the Famicom. The Famicom Zapper is a literal gun and plugs into an accessory port in the front that looks different than the NES ports. You can plug in other Famicom accessories like the Konami Hypershot into the accessory port and play games like Hyper Olympic. You cannot plug the Hypershot into the NES. But wait, the NES and Famicom both got a redesign in 1993, the new style NES and the AV Famicom. They look visually similar, but are still different in many ways. They both take cartridges from the top, but they're still not interchangeable. The new NES lost AV inputs compared to the original model. The new Famicom gained AV inputs compared to the original model. The one thing that's the same between the two systems are the controller ports, so now you can use your NES controllers on the AV Famicom. But wait, can you use the NES Zapper on the AV Famicom? No, you can't, because the internal wiring is different. The AV Famicom still has its own accessory port on the side, which is not on the new NES. Alright, are you guys keeping up? This is the Family Computer Disk System, aka Famicom Disk System, aka FDS. It was an add-on released for the Famicom in 1986. It was never released for the NES. The FDS is not the Japanese equivalent to the NES, that's the Famicom. Everything related to the FDS was exclusive to Japan unless the game was later ported over to the NES. The FDS has exclusive games, but it is not a standalone system. It requires the Famicom system to work. You connect these together and turn it on and it goes... This is the BIOS for the Famicom Disk System, not the Famicom in general. You turn the Famicom off about a cartridge, it'll just go. The The FDS uses floppy disk instead of cartridges. This is Super Mario Bros. On the Famicom Disk System. This is Super Mario Bros. On the Famicom. Floppy disk, cartridge. Without the FDS drive, you can still play cartridges but not floppy disks. And you cannot normally use the FDS on the NES unless you're incredibly creative with third-party adapters. For the love of Virtual Boy, please do not call it the NES Disk System. And now you know the difference between these three things.
Yeah, my friend specifically requested me to play this video at this panel, so. All right, let's move on. Now let's actually go into the differences in a little bit more detail than that. More so just the Famicom and NES itself. I'm not going to really be tackling the add-ons and stuff, and I'm mainly going to be discussing the hardware differences. So with that in mind, we should discuss what makes the Famicom and NES similar in the first place. So, first of all, most obvious thing, the core hardware is generally the exact same. Super Mario Brothers on the Famicom and NES run exactly the same between the two. Sure, there can be regional differences between certain games, but in terms of functionality, there is basically no fundamental difference in how it operates in most cases. We'll get into some of the caveats later. Let's see. Sorry, I lost myself. Yeah, so both the Famicom and NES use cartridges. Now, the pinouts are different, but I'll get into that in the next slide. But both are cartridge-based video game consoles. And yeah, the controllers are more or less the same, at least on controller number 1. It has a D-pad, 2 buttons, start and select. I mean, that's more or less the general similarity between the two. So let's actually go over what's different about the Famicom and NES. First of all, the branding's completely different. So when, hold on, I keep on losing myself in this script, I apologize. Yeah, so the branding was completely changed when Nintendo redesigned the Famicom for the United States. This not only extended to the console design, but also the whole naming scheme of everything in general. To the point where they referred to cartridges as game packs to avoid any association with video games in general, because they were trying to market it as a toy rather than a video game system. Whereas in Japan, it was always a video game system since day one. Like, kids wanted a Famicom back then for its arcade games like Donkey Kong and Xevious, while parents bought it for games like frickin' Golf and Mahjong, which, yes, actually did sell pretty well back then. Since, you know, like the whole naming scheme of the family computer, it's named that because it's meant to be like a computer for the family to like use instead of like a personal computer. So, all right. So the biggest fundamental difference is that the Famicom, the consoles are completely different. The Famicom, like most notably, like functionality-wise, is that it is a top-loading console, whereas the original NES model was a front-loader. And while nowadays you'll find plenty of NES consoles that have pretty faulty pin connectors, Famicom consoles, their pins tend to hold up pretty well. You'll find some that have some wear to them, but not nearly as bad as the bendy pins that some people even have to boil to correct. Yeah, the cartridges are also different. They're not only smaller, but the pins are also a different number. So on Famicom, there's 60 pins, but on NES, there's 72 pins. So you can't take a Famicom cartridge and put it into an NES and vice versa without a pin adapter of sorts. So you can technically play Famicom cartridges on an NES and vice versa, but in terms of the time of release, like between the two, I mean, they're not interchangeable as intended. And also, Famicom cartridges, unlike with NES where they're like all gray except for like the 2 gold Zelda carts, they come in all like different colors and sizes and everything. Like Famicom carts are about as tall as trading cards, but they can get as big as like maybe a little bit like shorter than a typical NES cartridge. But they're still fundamentally like smaller, more colorful cartridges compared to what you find on NES. So things like the Bondi Family Trainer cards and the later Calico releases that they had with the weird white and black cards. Controller 2 has a microphone. So you'd use this for a few like supported games that utilize it. Not a whole lot of games use the microphone. And the microphone actually outputs through the RF signal, so you can actually hear your voice through the television, and it also acts as an input method. And the most famous example that everyone likes to bring up regarding the microphone is in Zelda no Densetsu, or The Legend of Zelda, where in Dungeon 5, if you scream into the microphone, that kills all the pulse voice enemies in like on screen. But it was also used in one of the more infamous Famicom games, Takeshi no Senjo, or Takeshi's Challenge, where one of the many steps required to beat that game, you have to sing karaoke into this thing in order to, it's literally one of the steps to beat that game. But the microphone only checks whether you're speaking into it or not. It can't actually detect what words you're saying. So in other words, think of it as like how the DS mic worked and stuff like that. And yeah, the Famicom has a 15-pin expansion port on the front. So because these controllers are hardwired, you can see the front 15-pin expansion port at the front. That was used to plug in external accessories and other controllers. The most common use for the expansion port was the use of turbo controllers. So like the Hudson Joy cards, for example, where for like shooters like Star Soldier, you'd be able to just hold the button down and then just let auto fire do it. But also you can use the external controller as a third player. So games like Mario Twinbee or Bomberman 2, you can have 3 players instead of standard 2. But this port is also where you plug in the light gun and also the Famicom 3D glasses, which were 3D glasses for an 8-bit console. Only 7 games supported it. Needless to say, it did not do well. And yeah, this port does not exist on NES. There is a different expansion port you can find on the bottom. It's a bit sealed up and you have to like peel it open. But unfortunately, it was never used officially either by Nintendo or third parties. There are homebrew stuff you can find that use the port nowadays, but in terms of official use, it wasn't used back then. And finally, the biggest hardware difference that I alluded to earlier is expansion audio. And expansion audio is basically later Famicom releases that had enhancement chips in them, and some of those enhancement chips came with their own audio chips that enhanced the Famicom audio by passing through the audio through the cartridge port and out to the television. And unfortunately, this functionality straight up does not exist on unmodified NES systems. You can mod them to add them or even utilize the unused expansion port to re-enable the feature, but in terms of stock systems and the time of release, it was never an official supported thing. And it's kind of hard to describe in words, so I'd like to present a quick little example of expansion audio between the Famicom and the lack of it on NES. So here's one of my favorite games, Gimmick. Also released on NES as Mr. Gimmick in Scandinavia countries. So let me get the audio track for this. Apologies for that. That should be on the other screen. It's all right. Here we go. by the way, is Unused in Gimmick. You can only find that in the sound test. Great game, by the way. I'd highly recommend picking it up. Probably pick up the re-release on Steam and Switch, though. Don't pay for the original cart. That's $300. That's beside the point. So why does the internet label the Famicom as the NES in the first place? So outside of Asia, the Famicom is more or less an unknown console outside of Japan. No one knows what this red and white machine is, at least to the people casually, like, not really in the know-how of video games in general. So why confuse them? Why confuse them? Avoid explanation. Just label everything as NES. We don't need to make the distinction. Everything is just NES, and we don't have to have this conversation. But most importantly, and the core issue that I have is that there is a Western focus that takes priority when it comes to documentation on video games. And anything outside that kind of gets the short end of the stick or is basically non-existent. That has improved within the past 5 to 10 years since, but it's still pretty dire in comparison to what you find with local games that released here in the States. And give me a second, I'll give context to this. And yeah, it makes trying to research Japanese video games difficult when information on the internet is more or less just American focused. So out of all this bad and freaking non-existent documentation, I was trying to look for as someone trying to collect Famicom stuff, trying to understand what these games are. I was wondering, like, man, how is no one on the English internet attempted to try to dig into this further? I was talking to one of my friends, Anchan Bro, on Discord, and he was like, "Oh, you should talk to the folks at the OpenWiki project because they might hook you up with hosting a wiki." And I was like, "Wait, you can hook me up? We can do that?" So this is now we're starting to roll into how FamiWiki got founded. Out of my frustration that I could not find much info on Famicom stuff. So let's first discuss the building blocks of wikis in general. So almost every wiki on the internet runs on MediaWiki, which you can consider to be the engine of a wiki site. You don't really have a wiki site without the engine. So stuff like Wikipedia and other wiki hosts use MediaWiki, and that also does include FamiWiki. And speaking of hosts, you're going to need hosts to run your engine, and the engine, again, is MediaWiki. So there are plenty of options you'll find, like wiki.gg and Mirhaze, I believe that's how you pronounce it. These are excellent options if you want to like host your own wikis on different kinds of subjects. Although one of the first things my friend told me when we were considering opening a wiki is, dear God, avoid fandom at all costs. And unfortunately, I don't have time to get into it. I recommend watching this video on your own time after the panel. But if you're at all remotely familiar with wiki sites in general, you may have heard of the sketchiness of fandom and its ad-ridden like platform and everything. So he wanted me to avoid this at all costs, and I was perfectly fine with it because I was already aware of the really sketchiness of fandom as a platform to host this. But FamiWiki does not use fandom. We don't use the other host that I showed earlier. Instead, we're hosted through the OpenWiki project. And the OpenWiki project is a group that was founded out of necessity to help people write about the things they're passionate for without having to worry about stuff like financial costs and ego getting in the way. But it's mostly just a chill group that helps try to get wikis hosted on the internet. And in February 2023, I proposed to the OpenWiki project about opening my own like Famicom Wiki. And while my frustrations and the poor documentation were a major factor in submitting a proposal, into creating something like this, it wasn't the only inspiration I had. By far, one of the biggest inspirations outside of my frustrations, hands down, has to go to R&D Stranger's Fami Daily series, where, no joke, he cataloged every single Famicom cartridge from 1983 to 1994, starting in 2021, day after day. He describes it in like an overview style, going over the history, the cultural context, how the game plays, stuff like that. And it is such an immensely useful resource. And I really, if there's anything that you should definitely check out after this panel, it's this YouTube channel. He's actually currently going through the Famicom Disk System library right now. He just uploaded a video on Mario or Family Computer Golf Japan course. So he's making progress on that right now. But yeah, this was a pretty big inspiration because he covers a lot of the same stuff that FamiWiki is going to be covering. But another inspiration, and one that predates this by several years, was Famicom World. And this site got its start in 2006 and kind of more or less got the same start as I am with FamiWiki. And this was one of the first dedicated websites to the Famicom. And it has some pretty good articles you can find. Like, has some pretty nice information you can scour through, but unfortunately it wasn't anything that I was particularly looking for. It goes in a more surface level type of scope of what they cover, and I wanted more deep coverage that covers literally everything you could ask for, because I wanted to know, like I want to grab a Famicom cartridge and be like, yes, I want to learn and understand where this thing came from and how this works. And unfortunately, most of the pages on Famicom World, most of their game pages are pretty much blank. Which this isn't discounting Famicom World. This is a freaking incredible resource that I've even referenced from time to time, but it wasn't enough for me to be comfortable with. You know, I didn't just want to rely on the bare bones documentation that this currently has. And hold on. So this is what I wanted out of the Famicom Wiki. I wanted to cover all the hardware and software that exists, all the add-ons and accessories, the history and background of all of this. Have all the advertisements and commercials that were put out at the time. And most importantly, I want to create by far the ultimate Famicom database you can find on the English internet. That is the biggest goal I want to have when it comes to building a Famicom wiki. So shortly after I submitted the proposal, I would rename Famicom Wiki to FamiWiki, and this is actually the concept logo design I came up with that later. The video I showed you, that's actually the same guy. He did the finalized logo for me, which is very appreciated. But the reason I shortened it is that Family Computer is like, Famicom is already an abbreviation of that original name. So I kind of wanted to encompass the same kind of spirit with our wiki site, and thus we came up with taking Famicom, replacing com, which is originally computer, and making it FamiWiki. So it's now a Famicom wiki. So it keeps the subject matter intact while being pretty unique instead of just being a generic name per se. So a few weeks later, on March 21st, 2023, the proposal got passed on the Open Wiki project, and one day later on March 22nd, the website went online for the first time, and this is an archived screenshot from roughly around a week or so after it went online. It looks pretty bare bones. We did definitely refine the main page a little bit, but we still got some work to do on that. Let's see. And this pretty much began my journey into documenting like everything I can about the Famicom. And the moment this went online, one of the first things I wanted to address is, all right, how do I separate the Famicom and the NES? And the solution that I came up with was trying to establish our own definitions as to what consoles and platforms are. Now, these tend to get thrown around interchangeably, and is a matter of interpretation at the end of the day. So for FamiWiki, we came up with these two definitions. A console is a computer designed to run software made for it, and a platform is an ecosystem that encompasses the software designed for specific consoles. And to give a more modern example of what I mean by this, let's look at the Nintendo Switch. So you got the original Nintendo Switch model, you got the Switch Lite, and you got the OLED model. And these are all different consoles. So they're all distinct, but they fall under the same platform. And that platform just so happens to just be Nintendo Switch. And this kind of also follows through how Nintendo has marketed it, as it's the family of systems, more or less, which is kind of the idea I had when coming up with these definitions in the categories and stuff. So what about the Famicom and NES then? So let's step back and let's put this into an analogy. So let's say we got a house, and the house is the platform, right? And in this house, there are two rooms. You have the Famicom room and the NES room. And just like any other house, there's also a living room that, tends to get shared between the people living in there. And that you can interpret as the similarities between the two. So, with their definitions, the Famicom and NES are distinct, as distinct consoles. But they live in the same house. So what do you call the house? And for FamiWiki, what is the platform called? And I didn't want to just pick a side and just pick, okay, the platform is called Famicom, or no, the platform is called NES. That was the mistake that many other sites made that I wanted to avoid with FamiWiki. So my solution ended up calling the platform 8-Bit Nintendo as a general name that encompasses the two. So they fall under the same platform while also being distinct at the same time. And how I came up with this name was how back then people used to call these old video game consoles like, oh, these are your Nintendos, your Segas, or if you're really old, your Ataris.
Sorry, buddy.
I'm not doing that.
I was doing my YouTube thing, do you think?
All right.
This guy was up until 3:40 in the morning last night typing this out.
That is true.
Yeah, no, I was the one that said finish it up, bro. I'm gonna punch you in the face.
All right, let me finish this slide up.
Bro face.
Where was I?
I love you, Brendan.
Where was I? So I wanted a generic name for this, and I didn't want to pick a side. So I took inspiration from how people used to call these by generic names, but I didn't just want to call the platform for this Nintendo because Nintendo the company exists, and that would just get confusing. So I tacked on 8-bit at the start, thus being distinct enough while also being a nice generalization that fits quite nicely and works really good for what we're trying to do. And as a result, we're able to do stuff like this, have different software pages for both the Famicom and NES with what released on what. Where many other sites would just label it one or the other. And as far as I'm aware, FamiWiki appears to be the only website on the internet that does this. And this might sound like I'm really stretching things, this might sound kind of ridiculous, but even Nintendo kind of makes this distinction officially. As you can see from the Nintendo Switch Online service, whenever an import game from the Famicom and Super Famicom get put on the service, they specify it's for that system. And heck, even, I can't believe I'm using this example, in the freaking Yuzu lawsuit, they made that distinction. And yes, I should tell you, I did read that whole thing. But yeah, they make the distinction officially, which makes me a lot more comfortable that I feel like what I'm doing here with FamiWiki and separating the two is like, you know, that's more or less correct. So now let's get out of the whole like the differences between the two. What is actually on FamiWiki? So there's 6 different main categories that you'll find on FamiWiki. That's hardware, which encompasses like the different hardware that was released for the Famicom and NES and so on. You have the software, which is more or less pretty self-explanatory. It's the category that by far has the most pages on it, and I will be more or less discussing a little bit more at length. Unfortunately, the rest of the categories aren't as fleshed out, so I'll be mainly discussing the software side of things today. But media is where it covers the different media that was released at the time, from like magazines to strategy guides, and in some cases even like VHS and DVD releases that relate to the Famicom. We have accessories, all different types of accessories. So like I mentioned, stuff like the Joy-Card, the Famicom 3D system, and so on. Add-ons aren't in accessories. The add-ons, like the Famicom disk system and the DATAC, are categorized in hardware, and it's in a subcategory, so just to make that distinction. You have companies, so like the developers, publishers, and like other key notable companies that had a hand in the Famicom at the time, and people, which more or less is like game developers or people like who have more or less just companies, except it's people this time, just like, you know, they have an association and worked with it. So going through the software stuff, because that's really the main core of things. Because I mean, we do have hardware pages, but I'm losing my train of thought. I apologize. So we have a few pages on the other stuff like I mentioned, but the main meat of FamiWiki is its software pages, and that's kind of what I intended when opening this site. So going from the top, the names we use on FamiWiki are the Romanized English names, and specifically ones that are in full and not uncut. So that also includes the subtitle of the game. So like this example here, we have Godslayer and the subtitle over there. And that's the game page for that. And the shortened one is used as a redirect. And any localization for particular software is also turned into a redirect. So if you, let's say you know, here actually I'll use Zelda for example, The Legend of Zelda. If you look up The Legend of Zelda on FamiWiki, you'll get redirected to the Hyrule Fantasy Zelda no Densetsu. So definitely keep that in mind when you're searching things. You're free to just use the localized names. Let's see. So this is what the software pages look like. This is one of the more fleshed out ones. So we have the full software name, a short description of the game, like at the top. So we got Elasis and Nazo being a side-scrolling game, being developed and published by Sunsoft, and then released on the Famicom. And we're using full names on here because that's our policy and stuff. And we also have an info box on the right side. So we have like the developer, publisher, the retail release, like price that's in the end. And I should mention we do have a USD conversion, but that does not account for inflation. That's something that I do kind of want to work on eventually. But yeah, so we got release dates and as for the other content, so we go through like the gameplay. If the game has a plot, we go over that. If the game has any secrets or other Easter eggs, we also cover those. And also the legacy and other notable bits. And Oh yeah, if a Famicom game released on NES, we also have tabs to where you can switch between the NES box art on the top. You can also see the cartridges as well. Unfortunately, this is a static image, so I can't really demonstrate that right now. But if you go on FamiWiki and like tap through the different tabs on the info box, then you'll see the different images and stuff. And yeah, I'm really proud of how these info boxes turned out. They also include links to other wiki sites that have a little bit more information, maybe some stuff that we can't quite cover within our own scope. Like Strategy Wiki, for example, covers like the actual strategies on how to beat a game in particular, which isn't really something that we're trying to cover. We're just trying to describe what something is rather than how to beat something. And also we have links to like Famicom World and everything. And also below at the very end of these software pages is a gallery, which not only includes the box arts from the info box, but all the other remaining stuff that couldn't fit in there. So stuff like the other regional variants, the print ads at the time, the title screens of games, and even the commercials sometimes. So, and you really get a picture on what the initial release of these games were at the time. And this all sounds pretty promising, especially for the many Famicom games that never get this treatment of documentation, which, unless you count the FamiDaily videos, but we're trying to cover much more ground here than what you can cover in like 6 and 7 minute videos. There are still plenty of issues to iron out. One of the first issues, most pages are blank. I know I just mentioned that Famicom World also has pages that are blank, and a year has passed, and yeah, we still have that problem as well. Our info boxes are at the very least filled out. There are a few that I did have to correct after the fact, but in other words, they should be accurate. But they have no box art images. The page is completely blank. They need info to be filled out. So if you're interested in enjoying FamiWiki, maybe there's a game you enjoy that you can maybe fill out info for. Feel free. I mean, there's a lot of software that needs this treatment. But another problem, the policies and guidelines aren't really set in stone yet. What I mean by this is just in terms of scope, that's already been figured out. So like we cover 8-bit Nintendo software within the Japanese perspective. And specifically, of course, the Famicom and stuff like that. But things like editing guidelines, how you should word things in particular, and other details have been more or less loose, unfortunately. We haven't really nailed down what things exactly should be. And the main reason for that is I've been more or less a major contributor to the site. I've been editing FamiWiki almost every single week since the site went online over just about a year ago. And barring a few sparse edits from a few contributors, which I do appreciate, I have been really the only major person that actively edits on the site, adding information to certain games. And for how big the scope is for this, it's too much for one person to really try to cover. It would take years to even come close to what I want from this site. And yeah, the scope is huge, but the community is just too small right now. Like on Discord, we have like a whopping 33 members on our Discord server right now, and for registered accounts, we only have about less than 20 at the moment, which is not great, especially for a young wiki site. But that's partially the reason I kind of want to hold this panel, is to kind of like spread the word that yes, a site like this exists. If you're interested in contributing, feel free. I really appreciate it. and there's a lot of potential to come with FamiWiki. Like, I want to cover the remaining aspects of the Famicom, like stuff like the day tag, the disk system, the network system, and the study box, and so on. I want to cover so much more than what is out there. Like I said, I want this to be the ultimate Famicom database. Everything you could ask for. I want more ways to search for pages. I know there's certain people who you can't read Japanese. Like, let's pretend like I can't read what Donkey Kong is. Like, what is this? Well, maybe you can look up the cartridge code. Or in some cases, if you have like a box for a game, like you can look there for Yume Penguin Monogatari, you can search up the barcode for that, and you'll be able to pull up the page for it. And I really want to experiment with more ways to be able to search for this stuff and make it easier for people to research this. I want to start including stuff like the Super Famicom and Super Nintendo. And yes, that also includes the whole 16-bit platform shenanigans stuff with applying your definitions and everything. We do have a few Super Famicom pages, but not even remotely compared to Famicom. We actually, just fairly recently, 3 months ago, we have every single page for every single Famicom cartridge release. Sure, like I mentioned, most of them are blank, but we do have pages for every single one of them. That is currently not the case for Super Famicom stuff and all the other add-ons I mentioned above, which will definitely be taking priority first before we delve into a whole different set of consoles. And I want to see more future growth in this community, because I feel like there is a lot to be gained with this knowledge. Like, even if you aren't in the Japanese video games, like being able to know this stuff, especially if you like collect video games, it is such a valuable resource that just at the moment doesn't exist. And like I mentioned, we tend to look at things in the Western perspective. Like, I imagine most, if not everyone in this room, is familiar with how the NES saved the video game industry from the crash of '83 after Atari ruined everything. But not as many people in comparison know about how the Famicom hardware developed, how the initial hardware design was made out of a challenge to get a good home port of Donkey Kong running, and how the Famicom boom era was like a major cultural thing within Japan, and also things like the whole like RPGs being a huge thing on the Famicom, and Dragon Quest III absolutely breaking the country. Oh man, I got ahead of myself here. And most importantly, there's a diverse library where ideas evolved, genres developed, stuff that was practically invisible outside of Japan, yet had a massive impact on the games that we love today. There's an entire culture that you can get to learn about as you delve into the Famicom, which is why whenever I see something Famicom related get labeled as NES, you lose that cultural connection. It fundamentally rewrites history to something that isn't true. I could have complained about this issue endlessly. I really could have. But if there's something that you should take away from this panel, complaining about something can only do so much at the end of the day. And it'd be so much beneficial if that energy was instead put into striving for something different. Creating something that helps fill a void. Even if your initial spark of inspiration came from mild annoyance, at the very least, you'll help someone out there in the world get the info they need. And with that, that's more or less my talk on FamiWiki. I am more or less open for questions at this point. So feel free to, if you have any questions about FamiWiki, apart from these two. I know I mentioned the first one at the very start, but just to be clear.
Well, I mean, you could always use some help. I got some Famicom games myself. I got a full completed box of Sweet Home. I could probably help out with that because we never got that game.
Yeah.
And that is one game I want to. I am from the Church of Sweet Home, and I want to spread the gospel.
Oh, absolutely. Sweet Home is such a cool game.
Yeah,
I've only played it a little bit, and it's such a neat thing.
Yeah, I was able to get a completed box, so it came with the manual, the poster, that'd be good stuff. I could probably upload that, email it to you, or send it through your daddy here.
Feel free. I saw you had your Henry stuff.
How many games do you have, and which one's your favorite?
How many games I have? So I don't have an exact number at the moment. I believe I am just shy under 300 cartridges at the moment. I actually just got like a bulk of Famicom cards just a day before GameOnExpo. Mostly just stuff to like tick off a box and everything. Collecting Famicom cards is really fun. I've really enjoyed the experience, and it also gives me more motivation to go on my wiki site and try to cover the games I get and everything, and be like, yeah, I can upload the box art and like maybe add a little bit of info here and there, just things like that. I do have a few in box as well. The most expensive, recent expensive game I got was New Ghostbusters 2. Ooh. I got that at Fallout Games for a whopping $90.
That's not bad.
Yeah.
And he asked what was your favorite game?
Oh, my favorite game. So I showed an example of Gimmick. That is by far my favorite Famicom. That is easily one of the best Famicom games you can ever play. It is a platformer that is easy to like kind of learn, like understand the controls a little bit, but it is so hard to master. Like you have to know the game inside and out to even get the bad ending. And yes, there is a good and bad ending to the game. And if you can get the good ending of that game, you have more or less mastered how platforming games are played in old video games. And I can beat that whole game with the good ending in like 40 minutes or so. So fortunately, I don't own a cart right now, which, yeah. Anything else?
How long did it take you to beat Ghostbusters after you got it?
Like 30 minutes. Yeah, I'm pretty good at old games. I have some experience. Anything else?
How long have you been working on this?
Technically a year at this point, because I have been editing almost at least every single week. Sometimes if I have literally nothing to do right now, or like I feel like I'm in a slump of, man, I'm bored, I have nothing to do right now, I was like, hey, I can go on the site, maybe fill out a few things, maybe upload a few things, and then move on. I mean, a little bit every single day really adds up over time. And that's something you should really do. Like, you shouldn't just sit around and like not do anything. At least put in just a little bit of work in something. And eventually you'll really appreciate the amount of work you managed to do. That it?
You have a Discord?
Yeah, we have a Discord. So if you go on FamiWiki.net, we actually have a Discord link on the front page. So if you're interested in joining, feel free. There is a little verification thing, but it's just counting Famicom cards, so you should be able to.
Do you work on game consoles that are worked on in Japan?
I don't do like console repair or modification. I'm more of a hobbyist in terms of just playing games and everything. The most I ever do in terms of servicing consoles is like, I open them up every now and then and see what the issue is, but I, at the moment, have no experience in terms of actually doing the repairs myself. But that's something I actually do want to learn myself eventually. Definitely an area I do want to explore. That it? All right, I think that will do it. And yeah, I think that's it. It's 12:54. Just about 5 minutes. That's more or less my panel. So thank you guys for coming. I appreciate it. Definitely check out FamiWiki.net if you're a Famicom nut like myself, or if you just like video game stuff in general, like with Nintendo's like 8-bit systems and everything. Like definitely check us out. Yeah, thank you for coming.